Lightbringer presents the Mythical Astronomy of Ice and Fire.
Con of Thrones 2018 discussion panel. What makes George R.R. Martin great? Featuring Secrets of the Citadel, Joe, Magician, and Lucifer means Lightbringer.
Nimble Dick is the highlight of that arc.
Yes.
Great. Seriously, how much Merlin knowledge do you have?
Try me.
Do you just come on to me? What's going on?
Maybe.
Good Lord.
This is what we came for.
Indeed. All right, it looks like everyone went to the Where Are the Damn Books, George panel. Disappointing. It's all right.
These are kind of opposite panels.
They are.
Yeah.
Well, they're kind of related.
I wanted to attend that one, but I did not. I'm not sure what exactly they said there.
Ours is more in defense of why it's taking them so long. Isn't
It is.
The
It
reasons that, give them a break. Look how much goes into this.
A lot goes into it. Did anyone go to that panel by any chance?
Yeah.
Over there in the left.
How was it?
It was good, but everyone seemed to be on the same page where everyone was just like, give them time. Like, nobody was really like...
Cool. That actually fills my heart with joy to hear that. That's outstanding.
Really, there was no one decrying wild cards?
No.
There were a couple jokes. It was mentioned.
Jokes are okay. We can tease them with jokes as long as we don't
Well, wild
troll.
cards are basically a joke, so that kind of works out.
Got him.
Hey. So we are here to talk about what makes George great. And in fact, that's why we're all here, because George is great. And I had this moment last night hanging out with some of my new friends that have recently changed from square icons on the internet machine into flesh and blood people. And we were talking about how much fun all of this is. And it occurred to me that we're basically all living inside George R. R. Martin's imagination. That's why we're all here. Everything that we're doing, dressing up, talking about, is basically inside of George's imagination. And the reason why that works is because George knows a lot about a lot of things. And he's put so many things into A Song of Ice and Fire that it's really just a jumping off point to talk about philosophy or horror movies or Marvel Comics or moon meteors or ancient mythology, War of the Roses, on and on and on. So in fact, let's go ahead and I'm going to let Gemma start this off. One of the first things that makes George R. R. Martin great is the fact that A Song of Ice and Fire is basically like a time capsule of great literature and mythology and culture. And there is just so much.
Yeah, it's basically like this tapestry, isn't it? It's like, those quilts that your grandma used to make and it had all those lovely patches on it. And every patch comes from somewhere. It's a reference, it's a nod, it's an Easter egg to something else. And if you don't get the reference, if you don't catch it, it's not something you're familiar with, it's fine. It's cool, you're enjoying it. But if you do catch the reference, then that's fun. There's some hilarious ones. There's some very serious ones. I mean, we all know the Yorks and Lancasters of the Wars of the Roses. That's your generic, obvious one that we're all aware of. That's your real life history. And then you can go straight to Kermit Tully from the Muppets. So,
Slightly less serious.
Wait, Kermit and Elmo.
Slightly less serious. And everything in between, basically. I mean, I've got a list here. I'm just going to throw some at you guys.
Good about it, yeah.
And then we can kind of open it up and discuss. I actually was born in Scotland. So I was born north of the Wall. Quite literally. I was born not that far from Hadrian's Wall.
I knew you were a wildling.
Wait, they're all the same, though. That's the point.
Hadrian's Wall. Discuss.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Well, the major point of Hadrian's Wall is it didn't stop anybody from going anywhere. It actually made trade more profitable, specifically around that wall because of smuggling. So people would go there to make more money, and the idea was like, we're going to keep everybody apart. Instead, they just mixed like crazy. And that's what we see from the wildlings and the Northerners, especially the county that it's from. It's Northumberland, I think that's where Hadrian's Wall is. Umber's on the south, the Wild Rings on the north.
George
Same
R. R.
thing.
Martin actually went to Scotland
Yeah.
when he was in the process of writing, and he stood where Hadrian's Wall kind of used to be, because it's basically a pile of rocks now. They tore down most of it to make churches, and so all of the smaller buildings that are in that area are now made from the rocks that once was Hadrian's Wall. But he stood sort of where it would have been and looked across and watched the sun go down, and he tried to imagine what that must be like, this beyond. These strange Scottish people, warriors that wore skirts.
And you can really see that moment in a Game of Thrones when Jon and Tyrion are atop the wall and they're looking into that dark forest and they're just like, anything could be alive in there. And all of a sudden, he even thinks to himself, all my little jokes about Grumpkins aren't that funny anymore. And he's like looking out there like, ooh, I could almost believe those stories about the others. So you can see that moment was written right into the story.
It
So
was,
that's great.
yeah. Speaking of Scotland, the Black Dinner and the Glencoe Massacre.
Oh,
What's that? The Red Wedding. It certainly is. There were two real-world historical events where a family was brought into a house under false pretenses and then massacred. But it was the Black Dinner and the Glencoe Massacre, and George kind of combined these two horrifying events, which then became what we all know as the Red Wedding.
that's one that I have heard a little bit about, but I don't know any more than what you just said. So, if Joe wants to comment,
I know nothing.
otherwise, you can go ahead and fill us in, Joe.
I know nothing. Well, I pretty much just summarised it, to be quite honest. Shall we move into some literature?
Let's.
Literature. Lord of the Rings, anyone? Lord
Yeah,
of
that
the
was
Rings?
a fun panel. There was quite a lot of Lord of the Rings in there. Specifically, if you look at the Valyrians, the connections between them and Sauron are explicit. They have the dragons, they have the fireworms underneath, like Glaurung, the original dragon that Morgoth.
They both have very good taste in clothing.
They do. They have the slavery aspect that Morgoth and Sauron are so famous for, but then you get them pulled into George's world, and instead you're presented with Daenerys, who you're supposed to have empathy for and sympathy for, and she's one of the heroines. It's like, but if you read that from Tolkien aspect, it's like, isn't she supposed to be a villain based on what we're looking at? It's a very fascinating one. He does that too with the Starks. Specifically, they're very close in terms of how they're described, like with their direwolves and the Kings of Winter with the Witch King of Angmar. And again, that's a huge villain, the head of the ring race. But again,
Yeah,
we're
the
rooting for them.
The Starks have the black iron crown with 9 spikes,
Yep.
just like they have 9 ring race.
Yes, and when Ned goes to the Tower of Joy, he describes his other men with him as his wraiths.
Yeah, great
So
race. Shadow swords.
Yeah.
Just more ring race stuff. And that's actually a good jumping off into the broader point of this is, oh God, I lost my thought. Go ahead.
Does anyone know what Frodo Baggins' father's called?
Oh yeah.
Anyone? Drogo Baggins.
And then
I love this stuff. I just love this stuff. You know, and like I said, if you don't know the reference, it's fine. You're enjoying the story. But if you do, you're...
Okay, so I remember what I was
You got
going to
it,
say.
okay.
So it's all about context. See, the idea is that what George is doing by referencing external ideas is he's sort of hiding more context for the story in there. So you can read the story without that context and enjoy it. But if you pick up on, for example, the similarities between the Valyrians and Sauron and his folks, then it creates a more of a context for the Targaryen experience. You can see that they feel evil, right? They feel evil right off the bat, and then George is cutting against that with somebody like Daenerys. And so that extra context, when you understand it, it sort of just deepens the richness of the experience. Because Martin is standing on the shoulders of giants. I mean, that's the simplest way to put it. He's not reinventing the wheel by any means. And so he's basically encouraging us to follow all of these influences, whether it be mythology or Lord of the Rings or English history. And by doing so, we learn a lot. And every podcaster that I've talked to has the same feeling that I do, which is that my life has been experienced. And I've learned so much just by researching and following all these loose threads. I didn't know crap about nature cycle mythology 3 years ago. I honestly didn't.
did a panel yesterday.
And I did a panel yesterday about it. And hopefully I didn't offend any Wiccans. But so that's kind of the point. Like, it's not just, oh, look, these are fun references. Martin is very much intends his story to be viewed in context of everybody that's come before and everyone that's come after. And I think he feels like he's carrying the torch that Tolkien and others carried. I think he takes it real seriously.
There's a famous quote, I'll paraphrase it, I can't remember it exactly, but it basically goes that if you steal from one person, that's plagiarism. If you steal from a multiple of sources, that's genius and inspiration.
He's stolen quite a lot.
He has, but like LML said, it prompts you to then go look into this further. I mean, I've read The Wheel of Time and a lot of H.P. Lovecraft because I've launched from The Song of Ice and Fire to do that. I need to know more about this Yellow Emperor, Robert Chambers, for example, and like I said, it's broadened my horizons. I know so much random crap now. I mean, I know all about the incest in the royal family of Britain, for example.
And that's greatly enriched your life.
And weirded me out a bit. But
weirded you out a bit because you're somewhat normal, right there in the front.
On the similarities topic, I just recently heard that Tolkien didn't finish his work, but he was his son. What would happen if George died?
He has said that nobody, whatever he writes is what he writes.
So the people keep suggesting, what was his name that finished Wheel of Time?
Brandon
Sanderson. People always ask him if Sanderson could do it. Sanderson
I think this
finished the first book. He never got through it.
I nominate this panel.
It would have to be a team effort.
There's going to be so many meteors if that happens. There's going to be meteors all the time.
Honestly, I just have to say that I have a real good feeling we'll definitely see the end of the series. I just don't think anyone needs to worry about that.
I just want to say about how it feels like sort of patchwork things, because before George R.R. Martin started writing A Game of Thrones, he was a sci-fi writer. He was a sci-fi horror writer. Game of Thrones came to him while he was writing Avalon, rest in peace, that we'll never see, his sci-fi book. And he got this idea in his head of Bran finding the direwolves, that whole scene from Game of Thrones 1. So this really is a love letter to everything he grew up with. This was not his job. This is the one he actually loves the most.
This is his life's work, isn't it? Quite literally. This is, and the passion. And the thing is, if it takes us 3 years to research one of the things that he's put into his texts, how long do you think it takes him to research and to go over these points and pull all this history, mythology, literature? It's huge. It's absolutely huge. Speaking of H.P. Lovecraft, that's one of my favourite, House Greyjoy. That's one of my favourite nods. I've got the quote, that is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die. And that's not George R.R. Martin. That's H.P. Lovecraft.
And made it a bit more readable.
He did.
Yeah, I've started recently listening to a little Lovecraft on audiobooks, and some of it is more challenging than others, but
it really sounds like Tolkien, doesn't it? But like much darker.
Yeah, there's a lot of that, and I like that style of writing. I don't find it hard to read, but there's actually I recently read The Doom That Came to Sarnath, which is one that George has drawn from a lot.
A lot, yeah.
And there's actually, I won't go into the whole Moon Meteors thing, but probably half of you in the crowd know my Moon Meteors theory. There is there is a scene in The Doom That Came to Sarnath where very strange monsters come from the moon. And it sounds like the Carthian myth. I mean, my God, it sounds like it. These strange beings come down from the moon one auspicious night after all the people have sinned and defied the old gods. And the next day, like, everyone's dead and gone, and the city's obliterated, and it's just a big swamp. And they're kind of like squisher beings, but they come down from the moon, so, you know.
Also, almost all of Essos is basically other stories, especially the Azor Ahai myths. Every name for him, except for Azor Ahai, I think comes from another book, doesn't it?
So yeah, Eldrick Shadow Chaser and
Eurothon Nightwalker?
Yeah, I was thinking of one. Harkoon the Hero is also from the Eldrick of Melnibone series, yeah.
He does that quite a lot. Westeros is full of them too, but Essos, because he doesn't have to write a narrative around there, because that's sort of his fake history, he goes off the wall with the references.
Yeah, he's got Carcosa and Kadaths right on the east, past Ashai and all of that.
And if I could say something about Lovecraft, I think what George R. Martin is making a statement about Lovecraft by borrowing from Lovecraft the same way that all fantasy authors borrow from Tolkien.
Yeah.
He's basically saying that Lovecraft's monsters, like the idea of a deep one, is now like an elf or an orc. And it's a universal fantasy idea that other people can now use, because Lovecraft has entered the status of, you know, the pantheon of whatever. And obviously Lovecraft is problematic, that must be said. But his writing is, it's now, George is basically saying that other people can use these monsters in the same way that everyone uses Tolkien's monsters. And that's, Tolkien basically invented fantasy by regurgitating Norse myth in his way.
Invented orcs too.
Okay, what have we got next? Ancient culture. The Old Empire of Geese, Mesopotamia, Marine Astapor-Kai, Egypt, pyramids, and the Valerian freehold is very similar to the Roman Empire. I don't know if
merged with Nazi Germany.
Yes.
Valerian, Aryan,
Yeah.
just make sure everyone's hip to that.
Yeah.
That's intentional.
I don't know if anybody's seen the maps where they get England and they kind of flip it, and then they paint the regions and they say, House like the Tyrell, the Highgarden, and that's France. And they try to attribute Northern Wall is Scotland.
Dorne is like Spain, Moorish, Algeria.
There's a point between England and Ireland, I think it's called the Giant's Causeway, and right if you match them up on either side of both islands, that's basically where the neck is. You just like smash them together like that.
I've visited there. That's where they film the Iron Islands. It's beautiful.
Yeah, and if you guys were writing your own fantasy novels, don't make it too hard, man. Just cut up parts of maps and all a day, write a good story. It's all about the heart and conflict characters. Right, go ahead.
Greek mythology. I mean, wow. We could do a 5-hour panel on that.
Yeah, Greek and Norse.
Yeah. I mean, I've got the Norse mythology. I mean, we've discussed Hadrian's Wall, Norse mythology, the Bifrost. That's an obvious one. But the Ragnarok tale in general, Ice and Fire.
You guys that watch the Marvel movies might have noticed Suitor with Lightbringer.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Wildfire, Robert's Rebellion, the Trojan War.
Greek fire.
I mean, there was
Also called St. Elmo's Fire, actually. Interestingly. Yeah, I kid you not. Go ahead.
Robert's Rebellion. Can you discuss how? I mean, there was no Trojan horse, was there? How is Robert's Rebellion like the Trojan War?
Oh, I haven't thought about that. I don't know. But this is, by the way, if anybody has,
Lannister man. Yes, Tywin. Tywin coming in as a friend.
Opening the gates.
Yes, that was the Trojan horse. Yeah. And how did it start? The
Helen.
Trojan War.
Helen
of Troy.
Leona and Rhaegar.
Yeah.
Okay,
Harrison
yeah,
at home.
You got it?
that's easier to see, yeah.
Yeah.
There are some Trojan War references with Daenerys, because when Euron launches the fleet of 1,000 ships, or 100 ships, it's very like, when Helen was abducted, she's called the face that launched 1,000 ships, because when she was abducted, I don't know, who was her husband? Thank you, launched 1,000 ships to invade Troy, so there's some references there too.
And then we've got Stannis and Shireen. That all brings that. So there's, like I said, Greek mythology in particular. And Circe, there is a goddess called Circe who lives in a forest surrounded by docile lions and wolves.
And she tricks them and lulls them to sleep with her magic.
Yeah.
There's some good stuff there.
How about Arthurian legend?
So Arthurian legend, okay, so this is a great example of a broader point that I wanted to jump out to, which is a lot of people ask me, how does George combine so many things, or how do you know that he's referencing this or that or this or that? And so, how does he do it? How does this process work? Well, I think I've figured out how this must work. Right? So, at some point, George decides, I want to have a flaming sword in my story. And when he does that, he's going to basically research all the flaming and shining swords in world mythology, and he's going to hat tip to all of them, out of respect. And so there's Arthurian Excalibur, there is the flaming sword in the Garden of Eden, there's Suitor's flaming sword, there's the red lightsaber of Darth Vader. All of that plays in. Thundar is a famous Hanna-Barbera comic. He has a sun sword which glows, and that happens right after a red comet comes by and messes up the moon and stuff. So, like, this is how it works. Like, when he sets out to do a flaming sword, he just sits back and like, all right, well, who's done that? And let's sort of pull from each, and whatever works for him, and then that becomes his whole deal. So, like, instead of King Arthur being the main character, now he's Arthur Dane, who's like an adjunct. So it's like a little bit of a flip, but it's, he's right there. So
yeah, I mean, the whole Tower of Joy scenario comes straight from Arthurian legend. Rhaegar and Lyanna are akin to Uther and Igraine, and their son was King Arthur. So Lyanna and Rhaegar's son being John. But then we've got Arthur Dane. We have an actual Arthur in the Song of Ice and Fire, who is Lancelot. his final resting place being the Joyous Guard, which means Tower of Joy.
That's right, and the founder of House Hightower was Uthor
Yes.
Hightower, just like Uthor Pendragon.
Yes.
And the rumors are that he slew dragons that were roosting on the Hightower.
And this is where a lot of those bizarre Arthur Dane being Jon Snow's father theories come from. It's not something I prescribe to, but
You can see
we're not here for that.
You can see Martin playing with those
Yes.
expectations. Though.
Yes.
He's also put a King Arthur directly in the story. He's referenced that Robb Stark is supposed to be very similar to King Arthur because he wanted to see Arthur from his mother's perspective. So that's why we get Catelyn's POV looking at Robb. That was his whole thing. He's like, it's always boring seeing inside the mind of the conqueror. You want to see how everyone else is looking at them,
Yes.
especially someone that doesn't see them as the conqueror, someone that sees them as their son, or just a kid.
That's cool. By the way, just if anybody has, we're moving from topic to topic real quick, so if anybody has a little thing they want to pipe in while we're talking about that thing, feel free to stick your hand up.
I'm just mad at George for saying that still, because has he not read Mists of Avalon? Because it's all about the women of King Arthur. And
He
it
might
came
not.
out like a long time ago.
It's possible he hasn't.
I just...
Could be a little bit of a blind
I'm
spot.
like, okay, so you know, like, weird, obscure Chinese myths, but you can't look up, like, one of the most famous women-written books about King Arthur? Okay.
Fair point, fair point.
Just a little mad.
He's very busy with his movie theater. So
Very busy with those wild cards.
Next one.
Okay, yeah, so I would like to bring up separate, a new thing that makes George R. R. Martin a great writer. This is actually one of those things, right in the back.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to backtrack for 1 second. You had
Sure.
mentioned the sword in the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you had any other biblical references, because as I read the books, there's so many, like...
George was raised Catholic, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's all over the place. There's a lot of baptisms.
Yeah.
There's some, not crucifixions, but there's a lot of sacrificial killings. What's that?
There are crucifixes too.
Oh, I guess there are.
yeah, he crucifies a bunch of people.
Oh, that's true. 163 slavers.
But even some of the phrases that he uses, they're just almost verbatim out of the Bible. So,
Yes.
I even like reading the annotated version. Sometimes it says like, this refers to Psalms, whatever. So I think that's interesting that he kind of touches upon that a little bit. I don't know if you...
So one of my favorite things that he incorporates is the Garden of Eden. And specifically, he's aware of an alternate reading of the Garden of Eden that comes from the Cathars of France. And this is kind of a Gnostic way of looking at it. So Lucifer means Lightbringer, right? So the snake in the garden, that tree the fruit that he was trying to convince Eve to eat of is called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And eating this fruit makes man like God, so says the serpent. Like God, having the knowledge of good and evil. So what does that mean? It means that before that fruit was eaten, mankind was in almost like an animal-like state where we don't even know right and wrong. We don't have the ability to choose wrong. Although that's a paradox because when she chose to eat the fruit, that was a sin, but let's not say that aside. The point is that you can read the Garden of Eden this way. Jehovah is trying to keep man in an ignorant state where he can't tell right from wrong. Along comes the snake saying, actually, you can elevate your consciousness and become like God and know right from wrong and make those choices yourself. And so the Cathars actually look at Jehovah as a demiurge and being an evil deity who's trying to keep man sort of imprisoned in a lower state of awareness. So that's just a completely opposite way to read it. But George is playing with this a lot in the whole Fire of the Gods concept with Lightbringer and the Weirwood Paste. Anything where man can become like God and elevate his consciousness, he's touching on those Garden of Eden themes. I've actually written about that a lot. It's one of my favorite topics. So that's a great question. Thank you.
There's also the he does it with the imagery in his works, and the image of Dani birthing her dragons when she stands and she's holding the dragons. That is almost a mirror of the birth of Venus, famous painting, and the birth of Venus itself was inspired by a painting of Christ being reborn after he was baptized.
And both Venus and Christ are, Christ is a morning star deity, and so his symbolism is actually based on Venus, just as Aphrodite is.
Yeah.
Oh yes, and even Daenerys like suckling those dragons, it's kind of even like could be like a Marian image if you wanted to imagine it that
So
way.
there's a scene, I'll get you in a second. There's a scene where Daenerys is waiting for Dario to come back after she's sent him away in ADWD, and she turns to her handmaid and she's like, I must be beautiful. I must And she's like, they ask her, what do you want to wear? And she's like, starlight and sea foam. And that's a direct Aphrodite foam-born reference. A star falling into the sea. So that's good stuff. You in the back had a question?
It's not an original idea. I watch a lot of YouTube channels. Hey, both of you guys.
Hi.
I thought Daenerys was a representation of the Book of Revelation.
Yes, I have. Revelation is actually sounds like one of my podcasts. If you go back and read it, it's all about falling stars and basically celestial calamities. In terms of symbolism, I mean, it's really intense. I got into that a little bit on one of my essays, and I was talking about Daenerys yesterday as like a kind of a cleansing fire. It's going to burn away all the rot and sort of maybe prepare the way for the next spring. And she's definitely kind of something a little apocalyptic about her for sure.
Yes, I think it was.
So next thing I want to move on to is something called the Unreliable narrator, and it sort of couples with the what's called third-person limited perspective. So the unreliable narrator, most of you probably know, but let's just say it. Basically, it means that you don't know if what you're reading is true. The author will never step out and say, and little did he know that was the last time he would ever see Jon Snow. You don't get those. Like, you get characters believing lies about themselves, and George is inviting you to take that journey with them and believe the lie or not. And the third person limited is basically, so the third person limited means that he doesn't step out and do the narrator's voice. The only time he does it is with Victorian when his hand burns.
Yeah, I think so.
And it's just like kind of real quick. There's a specific reason because we can't be in the room or whatever. But
it might happen in the prologue, like briefly. They switch between POVs pretty quick in that one.
Do they?
Yeah.
Oh, I hadn't caught that.
Yeah.
Okay. So in any case, by doing this, he's forcing you to ride shotgun in the brains of people who are all self-deluded in various ways, as we all kind of are. I mean, growing up and maturing is a process of ridding yourself of your delusions. So we've got examples like, so as far as I talked about setting a trap. As far as like, will you buy into these characters' illusions? So think about Robert. One of the first lies we're given is the whole cause of the war, and Robert and Lyanna loved each other, and Rhaegar stole her away, and we eventually find out that Robert is basically entirely self-deceived about this. But we don't know that at first. We're just getting Robert talking to Ned, and Ned's kind of listening to him going, okay. There's a little bit of a hint that maybe they're not on the same page, but it's not until later that we find out that Robert's self-deluded.
Yeah, there's a line where Ned says basically to Robert, no, her place is in the crypts. And that's a very strong pushback for him against Robert being like, you didn't know her. Like, she was a Stark. She wasn't Robert's woman. She was a woman of the North.
Absolutely. And then, or think about characters like Theon, Cersei, or Victarion. Okay, so these are all self-deluded characters pretty badly. But there's always a little kernel of truth or motivation in there, and so it's fun to take the ride. Now, those three are more obvious. Like when you read Victarion, it's pretty obvious, like, who this guy is a violent meathead. Cersei. Right. So, but then you have characters like Quentin and Ned. All right. Now these are people that have a noble self-delusion, where they're a little bit ignorant about how the world is, and their sense of honor is just a little bit naive at times. Or you have Jon Snow. He's a little bit, he's young, so maybe it's more immaturity as opposed to self-delusion, but he thinks that he's going to be able to let the wildlings through the wall and then lead an army on Winterfell, and that's going to be fine. And it wasn't fine. So as much as I think Jon is a good leader in developing leadership skills, like he made some clear mistakes at the wall in A Dance with Dragons that led to his murder. And what George is doing is, until that murder happens, he's inviting you to catch those mistakes or not. Like, we want to root for Jon, but we're supposed to be reading with a critical eye and going, why is he sending all his friends away?
Yeah.
That doesn't sound smart.
One of my favorite ones for that is actually Tyrion as an unreliable narrator. He's introduced as probably the most intelligent character in the story, so you're supposed to believe what he says a lot, but then he starts blaming everything in King's Landing on Cersei when most of it's not. And then the things he thinks about Shay and the relationship, there's a lot of self-delusion going there, but George very cleverly plays with it by making him so smart at first. Like, well, he's probably right, isn't he? And as everything in King's Landing falls around him, you're like, no, Tyrion can be very, very, very wrong, even though he's book smart.
And that has to be that way, because if you create a character in your books that knows everything and is always right, that's not interesting.
Yeah.
So, and nobody's like that. There's nobody, even the smartest friend you know, makes a mistake sometime or did in the past, so nobody's perfect.
It kind of works both ways though sometimes. Like Cersei, her point of view chapters are a really good example of this. She is clearly utterly self-deluded, and she talks to herself, and it's almost like she's convincing herself. She's talking herself around half the time, until she says it in her mind so much that she then genuinely believes it, and then she will act upon this new belief that she's forced herself. But in her internal thoughts, especially when it comes to crimes that people suspected her of in the first book, for example, many crimes that she didn't, and as readers, well, maybe she did, that this guy believes she did, and it probably was her, and then we find out 3-4 books later, no, she had nothing to do with it, because she's thinking, who was that?
And Martin also gives us those moments like where Ned and Ned and Cersei are in the garden, and Ned's confronting Cersei and be like, take your kids and leave. And Cersei's starts talking about, what would you do for your kids?
Yeah.
And Catelyn also follows up on that. Would I kill another child or save my children? George is always giving you a rationale, even for the most self-deluded characters. Like Ares was paranoid, but people were plotting against him.
Yeah, they were trying to kill him.
Well, you're only paranoid if you're wrong.
Right.
You're cautious if you're right.
And he also does this in reverse. Like, we've talked a lot about the characters who think more of themselves than they really are, but Sam is a great example of a character who thinks much less of himself than he really is. Like, if you read his point of view, he's constantly talking himself down internally and externally. But Sam has already accomplished incredible things in
I
his
think
story.
Sansa is another person like that, too.
Yeah, very self-deprecating, and then but you can see that
their actions don't line up with their self-perception.
That's a great point. Thanks for raising that.
I think one of my favorite examples of reliable narrators quickly is with the twin chapters of John and Samwell when he's sending away Aemon and Sam and Monster, and how each of them thinks what the other one is thinking. The actions in between is exactly the same. He uses it in a really clever way. It gives you a lot of rereadability, because you can go back and compare how each character's interpretations might be wildly off, even though the actual things that are happening are exactly the same.
It is a great example. So then, now the thing is, if I could go back and sort of talk about why this is important, what this does is it engages the reader. When the author spoon feeds the conclusions to the reader, it makes it like you're watching television. You're just sort of sitting back, it's all coming at you. But when you have to figure things out, it makes you get into the books, and it makes you engage with what's going on. And that is what you want to do as a writer. So the answer is, probably a third to a half of you are writers. I know everybody here is a writer. I mean, a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people in the fandom are aspiring writers. And this is just a super important lesson, I feel like. Make the reader figure things out. Treat your readers like adults. They're smart. Don't give them all the pieces of the puzzle, because this is what leaves room for debate. That's why we're all here, creating different theories and having debates and having different opinions. If you spell it all out, this all disappears. So, really, really important. And a complement to that idea is the idea of not turning the amps to 11. They do go to 11, but you don't have to turn them to 11. Okay, so let's think about, actually, go ahead. You can interrupt me. Go ahead.
Joe had a video yesterday about Daenerys and unreliable narrative. The lemon tree and the red door.
Yeah.
Would you say that's an unreliable narrative or a red herring?
Part of it is an unreliable narrator, because part of Dany's past is that she's moved so much. When you're that young, when that was happening to her, it's very easy to mix up memories. It's just a psychological fact that a lot of your memories from your childhood are not real, they're more constructed in that way. So while Dany, what she remembers as the house with the red door in Bravos, all the details might not be the same, but she probably did experience all those things at one time. But he's not telling you that. You have to know that on your own to come into that and look at the facts of it. And then he gives you more details where he's telling you from the Lannister Guardsmen and Sharna, and from where actually Bravos is. You can figure out for yourself what actually happened, but it's hard to rely on Dany and a lot of the characters in that way.
Good point, and good question.
No. It's not done.
Thank you. So as content creators, as you guys are, and I'm sure a lot of us in this room are content creators and super fans, how do you feel George's elevated writing style and putting all these things in there and leaving us all those clues, how do you feel like that influences the way you digest other media, like in a similar genre? Because
he's ruined everything.
I know.
Everything's a letdown.
She was going with that. Yeah, I will throw out a quick recommendation for Dark on Netflix. That is one of the recent TV shows that I feel like had depth. I rewatched it twice. Amethyst Qual, I watched it like 3 or 4 times. It's really good, but it's ruined a lot. And specifically, anybody that writes books where they have that heavy-handed narrative style, it's like, I'm not 13.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah. It's do we all feel utterly desensitized to so much now? Yeah. And you please don't lynch me, but I've never read Harry Potter. Because I tried, because I read The Song of Ice and Fire many years ago, years before the show. So by the time Harry Potter became on my spectrum, I was heavy, hard fantasy. And I was about 5 pages in, I thought, oh, this is a nice kid's book.
I mean, it is.
Sorry.
It
Maybe I'll give it a try.
For me, A Song of Ice and Fire got me much more into Lord of the Rings than I was before. I tried it when I was in middle school, and it was so boring and just so much landscape porn and talking about hobbits. I couldn't get through it. But after you look back...
Better than hobbit porn.
And then you look back and you see the connections after I read A Song of Ice and Fire. It's like, oh, the Witch King and Rob. And I loved especially the Ents and the Huorns and their connections to the Weirwoods and the Greenseers. I made a very long video about that. But that got me to read Children of Huorn, written by Chris Tolkien. And I never would have read that if I hadn't started with The Song of Ice and Fire, just because I wanted to know more about where George was coming from.
The Weirwood tree in the 3rd row.
Yes. For me, what makes A Song of Ice and Fire so special are the dynamic and super complex character conflicts that it's so rare to see in other works where, man, this character has these conflicts. You know, Theon wants to be loyal to the Starks, he also wants to be loyal to the Greyjoys, and you can feel compassion for that. It's like, no, you gotta do this, or no, you gotta do that. You can see both sides of it, and that's just really compelling, and we can relate to it because we have those conflicts. And not only that, but the character conflicts that George R.R. Martin writes, like they really underscore the greater societal conflicts and those thematic conflicts that are overarching in this story, and just putting it out there. It's very Shakespearean. I talk a lot about Shakespeare, and I did a Shakespeare panel this weekend.
Oh, you're Shakespeare of Thrones, right?
Yeah, I am Shakespeare of Thrones.
Right there. Quick shout out.
Yes,
The Weirwood.
yes, I didn't want you guys to leave here without saying it.
So and by the way, if you guys, it can't just be questions. If you have your own favorite thing that sort of fits in with what we're talking about, then by all means, we're here to oh, now the hands shoot up. Asking for trouble. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, back to the unreliable narrative. One of the very best examples of that is Cersei with the Blue Bard, and like watching someone delude themselves and believing the Blue Bard is guilty, and it's so cool to be in her head there and be like, wow, like, does she really believe that this guy did it? She seems to believe along the way until she, at the end, she kind of realizes that it's all bullshit. So it's just one of the, I love that scene. It's so well.
Cersei has some great chapters.
Yeah. That is actually one of the best examples. That's really good.
That's so good.
And to go back to what you were saying, I think that George is really good at doing double duty. So when he's developing a personal character conflict, he's also showing you a lot about the world. When he's doing world building, he's telling you something you need to know for the story. Like, for example, the legend of Durin Godsgrief in Storm's End is completely fantastical. It's a great myth. It's just utterly fantastical. Stealing a goddess from the sky, and the storms come and knock down 7 castles. So I built the 4th one, that fell over, burned down, and then sank into the swamp. He's 7 castles deep. The thing is that Catelyn remembers this story when she's on the way to talk to Renly and Stannis. And so what this is actually doing is setting up the Baratheons as stubborn-ass mofos who don't give in to anything. And so this world-building mythology is actually giving us the character of Robert and Renly and previewing the theme of the chapter and the conflict. So there's a lot going on. He never does one thing at a time. So
what ruined me reading The Song of Ice and Fire to reading other books? And so my first read-through I read like I had read other books. And what I realized when you talk about turning the volume, you don't need to turn the volume up to 11, like the freight pies. First time I read through, I didn't get the freight pies. And then when I read it the second time, then I realized you gotta parse every word. Yes. Every word is put in there. If he mentions something, that is not just an aside. It's gonna play into something, and you gotta figure it out.
Yeah, he uses keywords a lot.
Yeah. And it's ruined me for reading.
And Frey Pie is just way cooler because it's like kind of under the surface. If it was Wyman Manderlake dancing around, they'd be like, what is this?
Here's a slice of Rhaegar.
But once you realize that Frey Pie is a thing, and you go back and read that scene where Wyman's gobbling up and is like pile. I mean,
he's calling the singers the rat cook the third time. Let's go, man.
I mean, dude, it is one of the most visceral, like, oh my god, macabre. But you're. And Martin has managed to make you root for the guy eating the people.
You're happy about cannibalism. George, what is happening to us?
Let's just turn to that's it. Shut it down. Drop the mic.
So, Lycoon, or excuse me, the rat cook is actually a nod to the Beast of Lycoon.
Speak up a little bit.
So the rat cook is actually a nod to the Beast of Lycoon in Greek mythology. If you take a look at the story of the rat cook kind of tricks this dude into eating his own son, right? And it was just an abomination on a couple levels. But he was eventually punished and turned into a rat for trying to feed that person his own son. If you look at the tale of the Feast of Lycoon, Lycoon actually invites these people over for a feast, and it was actually Zeus that he invited over. And he tried to trick Zeus into eating his son. And he actually cooked him and tried to do that. And Zeus knew a little bit better, but in response, he turned him into a wolf. And that's the story of the very first werewolf. And of course, the Starks are all, kind of analogs, to dwarves and werewolves and stuff like that. So that's the story of the first werewolf.
This is the thing, these references, and this is what you said as well, that some of them, you have to read every word, and some of them carry such weight, and they're setting up, they're foreshadowing, they are huge, momentous. You go back and go, it was all there. And then others are just really fun, just really light-hearted, fun nods. Speaking of Harry Potter, Harry Sawyer and Robin Potter are both characters in The Song of Ice and Fire. They're both mock suitors. They basically take the mickey out of Brienne of Tarth. They pretend that they want to be with their suitors. So she gives Potter a nasty scar on his forehead in the bit originally. So you've got this heavy Frey Pie thing going on, and then you've got this character called Harry.
And it's all just context. Like when you know about the feast of, is it Lycaon?
I say Lycaon, but
Lycaon?
pronunciation could be off.
So like you can enjoy the story without knowing that. But if you learn that, then it just makes it a little more like, oh, it's more context for this. The rat cook doesn't exist in a void anymore. So
I just wanted to build up what you said, how you were like rooting for Manderley as he was eating the phrase. George does that a lot. That's part of the great thing. Like morally, you know it's wrong, but in the context, you're so happy. Like when Joffrey, this 14-year-old's clawing at his throat, you're like, yeah.
No, he's turned us into cannibals. We're all people that are like, yeah, well, you do have to sometimes stab your wife in order to make Lightbringer. I mean, you can't kill her. That's a given. So George is playing tricks on us and also setting traps. He's like, can I get my readers to cheer for cannibalism? Can I get my readers to, or at least, wonder about this? So yeah, this is his cool.
Can you cheer for Robb Stark going?
You in the back, yeah.
One of my favorite things with George Martin is his redemption arcs. My two favorite ones are Jaime Lannister. I love his. I loved Feast for Crows and the little bits that he had in The Dance of Dragons. And I also love Theon's. I know a lot of people are, one side or the other with Theon, but I love going back and seeing how he was. When he first goes back to the Iron Isles, and he's real cocky and arrogant, and he's been raised by Starks, and then he kind of gets slapped in the face by his family, and then everything happens with Ramsay, and you see him transform, and I
honestly.
I think George hates quarterbacks. Like, I think in high school, I think the football players rub him the wrong way because we see all these like alpha male, like preening like 17-year-old dudes. They all die.
Wait, Jamie, the initial pitch letter, Jamie ended up becoming king. He got everything he wanted, but he ended up changing that to a redemption arc and made him a much better character than just the jock jerk that he initially wanted.
Well, so that's what he's doing, man. He's essentially showing the process of a young man losing their young man delusions. And so John does, Rob dies, Theon dies, Joffrey dies. Poor Quentin, I guess, is not quite the same story. But just because he's not. Oh, I guess he is the firstborn. He doesn't fit that sort of entitlement role quite as much. But the point is, like, George loves taking people down a peg. But it's not just a matter of taking people down a peg. It's like, now we can do something useful. Because that's how all of our lives go. It's like you really start learning when your lives fall apart and you experience disaster, and that's when you start like getting tough and getting resilience and stuff. So this is how George is molding these people into interesting characters. In the blue.
That's exactly right, I think, what you're saying. And one of the things that I love so much about what George has done for me in my own life is that nothing is black and white, and nothing is simple. And I tend to simplify things sometimes, you know what I mean? And he's not like that. Nobody is all good or all evil, like we read Tolkien. And except what?
Except the mountain.
Yeah. We read Tolkien.
The mountain has migraines.
Yeah, but Davos is a bad husband.
Yeah.
Davos, he's cheating on his wife. That's bad.
Yeah, he wrote much more Boromirs than Faramir's, I would say.
No, that's a great point.
There's so much nuance, and I think that's helped me in my own life to be like, that's just not how life is. As somebody who tends to simplify everything, as someone who tends to see everything in black and white with no gray, the books themselves have really changed that, and I think
that's cool. I had a little bit of a similar experience with, I had a heavy religious upbringing, and they did the typical, swing the other way. I hate organized religion, and then I sort of come back to the middle. It's like, oh, well, actually, there's a lot to be said for philosophy and religious thought. You just can't take it quite so literally, and come back to the middle. And I feel like some of the exploration that I was talking about related to the Garden of Eden and some of that stuff has helped me sort of work through various lingering demons of my childhood. So, in the black shirt, yeah.
Number one, I also like Theon, so cool. Number two, the unreliable narrator, I feel like Catelyn is the worst. And then I have one question really quick. So what do you guys read now when you're done?
I'm reading George R. R. Martin's Dream Songs right now. His weird short stories from earlier in his life.
I was like Joe. I had to, after I read Game of Thrones, it took me 3 years to get into it. I had the books. I tried, I would get 80 pages in and be like, I can't do this. And then 3 years, literally, of doing that, I finally read them all in 2 weeks. And like you, I had to read something else. And it had to be that same genre. And I went straight to The Hobbit, read it in a day, read all the Lord of the Rings, and now I'm just like, what now? Because I can't get into Harry Potter either. So it's like...
It's not just me then.
Yeah.
So I like Pat Rothfuss. I like...
he's really good.
And it's kind of an easy one. And there's The Lies of Locke Lamora. Who's that author? Scott... He's really good. I like him.
I'm reading Zachariah Sitchin at the moment, which is not... Well, it is fiction, but it's presented as not non-fiction.
Scott Lynch.
Scott Lynch, thank you. Yeah, Scott Lynch.
It is nearly time.
Who's good friends with George Martin?
Just before we do finish off, I'd just like to mention it's my birthday.
Happy birthday!
Happy birthday! 3, 2, 1.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Gemma. Happy birthday to you.
I actually got congratulated on my birthday. And I thought, wow, I am officially old.
You made it this far?
I actually want to close with one last thing that I didn't get into that's really important to me. It's called In Late, Out Early, and it's coupled with lots of flashbacks. So this is what happens. Martin starts a scene right in the middle of the scene. So take the one where Ned Stark fights Jaime Lannister in the streets of King's Landing. The scene in the book begins with Ned walking through the rainy streets about to get into the fight. But as he's walking through the rainy streets, he remembers back to the brothel he was just at, and how he was talking to Bera's mother, and this whole confrontation with Peter Baelish. This is all happening in flashback as Ned's walking down the street. Then the fight with Jamie happens. So the whole scene actually takes place in one physical location, but we've got 3 different sort of stories happening. And Martin does this in almost every chapter. He never starts at the beginning. He always drops you right in. It's much more exciting that way. Then you're trying to figure out what's going on, what happened to the character the last 2 weeks that you didn't hear about, and it's all told in flashback. And by cutting up the timing like that, he can then superimpose themes that run through the chapter. So, for example, he can use a flashback to call out an idea that he needs in the current scene that wouldn't belong there otherwise. And so it's a great tool. It makes everything highly readable. Everybody who's an author should use inlaid out early. It's just, I mean, it's kind of actually basics for literature, but it's just, Martin does it so well.
And it takes you all over the place, doesn't he? Because like Tyrion will be walking from one location to another, and we know what happened yesterday. We know the conversation that he had that morning. We know the anticipation of the conversation he's about to have and how he feels about that. And then he'll cut back to when he was 10 years old and he was reading a particular book, and then something happens and you're all over the place, and he's maybe walked 200 yards.
That's right. And it's a great technique to use. And the other one is that he creates a lot of chapter parallels. When you have like 46 POVs or whatever, you have to create a lot of internal cohesion in the story. So you have all these characters that you can compare, like Daenerys and Cersei as ruling queens in the last 3 books. You can compare Jon and Dany as chosen ones, or Bran and Dany as people going on these sort of solo missions. It's endless. And there's a scene specifically, like the Dany scene in the tent of Shadows with Mirri Maz Dor is in many ways a flip of the Tower of Joy scene in symbolic language. And so by doing that, it makes the book rhyme and have cohesion, whereas otherwise it'd just be going sideways with all this many characters. So I feel like that's been a really crucial tool for him to be able to handle that many POVs. But
yeah, we could talk about this all day, and I think we will
expand
on this. So,
and that's kind of what we're doing at this con. So thanks for coming, everyone. Thank you. Don't let people troll George online, please. If you see him, block him or scold him or something.